So it's very tough to overcome, but here's the scenario. Let's say a patient goes to 5 different doctors to get 5 opinions, 4 of whom say, hey, I would do the procedure this way. The 5th one says, no, I'm going to do it this way. The patient decides to go to doctor number 5. Okay, what do you think happens? Patient has a complication and now turns around and sues doctor number 5. And the doctor says, hey, this was a judgment call. I used my best judgment. The fact that the doctor was in the minority of what procedures to use, is that enough to hold him accountable and hold him liable? The answer is no, it's not. As long as that procedure that he chose was within acceptable medical standards, even though he was in the minority and not everybody would do it, it's still appropriate. However, if it turns out that the judgment that the doctor used in order to do this procedure fell below the standard of care, now that's where we get the doctor. And I'll tell you how, give you a great example. And I call this 5 minutes of a urology procedure, 5 minutes of a urology procedure that destroyed this man's life. Here's the scenario. Young gentleman, 37 years old, was having difficulty urinating, goes to a urologist. It turns out the gentleman had scar tissue in the tube that takes the urine from the bladder out through the penis, called the urethra. So the doctor did a procedure to actually cut open the scar tissue, and it's called a cold knife urethrotomy. And it sounds as painful as it is. There's no anesthesia used during this, but you know what, it worked. The procedure worked, but it's a Band-Aid procedure because the problem comes back. So a few weeks later, the patient was back in the office with the same problem. And the doctor says, yes, you've got scar tissue again. Let's open it up. And he does it again in the office. So now again, it works. But a couple of weeks later, what do you think happens? It comes back again. The doctor turns around and says, okay, I've got a better solution, a long-term solution. Let's take you to the operating room. We'll put you under anesthesia. I'm going to put in a device called a stent, a mesh metal stent into the tube, that urethra, to keep it open. And this is designed to be permanent so that the skin tissue called epithelial cells overgrow it, and now it becomes embedded. And now it stays open. He's like, yes, let's do it. So he has the procedure done. Shortly after, literally before he gets home that day, he develops horrible, horrible pain. And by the way, the actual procedure worked, but now the patient is leaking urine. It worked so well. What happened next? Every morning when the patient would get up to go to the bathroom and he'd have an erection, he would have the most excruciating pain he'd ever had in his life. Horrible. Off the charts. If it was, you're talking about pain on a scale of 0 to 10, this was 100. He'd go back to the doctor and say, doctor, this pain is so horrible. I really am contemplating suicide. And the doctor wrote that in his notes. Not just once, but twice. And finally, after a couple of weeks, the doctor says, you know what? Let's go back into the operating room. Let's see if I can move that device, the stent, away. Maybe it's touching a nerve. Maybe it's too far back. Let's try that. Patient says, okay, please do something because this is horrible. So what happens next? So he does the procedure. During the procedure, remember when I said this is supposed to be embedded in his urethra? It's not supposed to be moved or manipulated because the skin overgrows it. The doctor is trying to grab hold of it and pull. Well, because it's not movable, he now starts tugging and pulling and pulling. This mesh metal device now starts shredding. And once he starts, he can't stop. And it's shredding, and by the time he's done, it had destroyed his entire urethra. This gentleman needed a 1.5 years worth of urological reconstructive surgery. And the doctor he went to have this done told him in 30 years of practicing medicine, he has never seen something so horrible. It looks like a bomb went off in there. He's like, who did this to you? He sues his doctor. The doctor says, don't blame me. This was a judgment call. I used my judgment to decide this procedure was right for this patient. And you know what? That's not a bad defense. But there was a problem. This doctor failed to recognize that this procedure that he chose was not intended for young men. It was only intended to be used for gentlemen 65 and older who no longer had the ability to maintain an erection. Why? Because the studies had confirmed that patients who were younger, who still had that ability to maintain an erection, would get excruciating, horrible pain. The doctor failed to know this. He failed to recognize this, and so he chose a procedure that departed and deviated from the standard of care, and that's how we were able to hold him accountable in that situation. So that's why a judgment call may not be the ideal defense when they turn around and say, don't blame me, I did nothing wrong.